Good morning, everyone. I'm Jeremy Pickens with Alabama Extension and Auburn University, and I'm here with my co-host Russell Wood with the Alabama Nursery and Landscape Association. And this is our monthly webinar series. We do this the third Thursday of every month. And as Russell said earlier, we do record these on the association's and post them on the association's YouTube channel. And he will send that link out in the chat box in a few minutes. Today, we got a great speaker and a great topic. We got Dr. Anthony Witcher. He's an associate professor at the Tennessee State University. He's at the Research Center there in McMinnville and does a lot of applied research, especially around weed control. And today, he's going to be talking about weed control and propagation. I know, a big deal for a lot of us. That's where a lot of our weed problems start. So I'm excited to hear this. And with that, I'll just leave it with you, Anthony.
All right, thanks, Jeremy. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. Hello, everyone. Let me get my screen up here. There we go. So I'm Anthony Witcher. I'm here at Tennessee State University in McMinnville, Tennessee, and so I'm going to kind of go over some of the challenges and opportunities that we kind of see in weed propagation or weed control and propagation. If I can get this to work. There we go. All right. So I'm just kind of going to give you an overview of some of the issues that we've seen in propagation as far as weed control, and can hopefully give y'all a few solutions to work with down the road. And so when we talk about propagation, so I'm in Tennessee. A lot of our growers are growing seedlings, and so they do this in containers and fields, field grown and container grown seedling operations. But most of the propagation that we're seeing in the industry, as far as like shrubs and those types of things, perennials, is done with cuttings. And so these are mainly done in containers, shade houses, greenhouses. Again, I'm in Tennessee, and so we do have some unique scenarios up here where people are propagating in beds, raised beds outdoors. And so a lot of different ways we can propagate, but the universal problem is weeds. Doesn't matter how you're growing them or how you're propagating them, we're always going to get weeds in them. I'm going to focus on propagation in containers today, and then kind of go over some of the things I've worked on the last few years and trying to help solve some of these issues. But the problem is, weed control begins in propagation, right? And so even if you're a container producer, you're buying in, even if you're not propagating your own material, you're buying in propagation material, buying in liners. They may look clean, but after a few weeks, they can look like this this picture on the right here. And so it does not take long for those weeds to get out of hand. Even if they look clean coming in, if they had weeds in them, they could already set seeds. You could have hundreds of seeds in those pots already. And so, sometimes, when we're propagating, sometimes you ship them out quickly, but sometimes they sit for a while. And so the longer they sit, the more apt they are to get weeds in them. And so you try to clean them up beforehand, but inevitably, you're going to have some issues. And so, and it all starts in the propagation environment where you're propagating at. So in the shade houses and the greenhouses, you can get bitter cress is probably the number one weed we're looking at in some of these scenarios, because it likes the shade, likes cooler temperatures, likes high moisture. It just really likes that environment. So you get it growing on the sides of the greenhouses or the shade houses, on the floors, in the gravel floors, and everywhere. And even in these little trays on the right here, you can see these are like 50 cell trays. You've already got dozens and dozens of different little seedlings coming up in there. And so it does not take long for these things to get out of hand. And this kind of gives you an idea. This picture on the left, these are just about 6 different weed species that I planted in some trays. Just after a few weeks, they germinated. They're small. But on the right, that's just 4 weeks later. And so in a really short amount of time, they can go from really small to just overtaking your crop, especially in propagation. We're using smaller containers, trays, flats. It does not take long for those plants to get overshaded and die out. Those weeds can kill out your liners. And if you look at the picture on the right, the far right, that's bitter cress. And so it can actually go from seed to flower and seed again in like 6 weeks. And so some of these weeds have really short life cycles. and it doesn't take long for them to start spreading their seeds all over the place. And so talking about where do weeds come from? Well, there's a lot of different places they come from. And particularly in propagation, they can come from your container substrates. Now, most of the time growers are using bagged material, bagged substrates, bagged potting mixes. But, pine bark is one of the main materials that we're using for cutting propagation. So if you are storing pine bark outside, if it's not stored properly, it's exposed to the elements, you can get crabgrass, spurge, all types of things blowing into your piles. And so keeping those clean is really number one on the list. Containers. I now know in propagation we're probably not reusing a lot of containers, but if you are, some of these weeds have sticky seed coats. So like bittercress, oxalis, once those seeds get spread around, they can actually stick to the rim or the inside of the containers, and then they just become a problem down the road. And so that's a place they can come from. The shade house, greenhouse floors, like I already talked about, surrounding areas. So if you've got walkways, ditches, grassy areas or surrounding your greenhouses, those weeds are going to come in. A lot of these things come in from birds or animals spreading them, but also wind blows them in, and then some of them have their own little unique mechanism for flinging their seeds, so that once they get mature, so something like bittercress or oxalis, they can actually fling their seeds several feet on their own, and so it doesn't take much for them to get spread around. Stock plants. So if you're taking cuttings from plants around your nursery, keeping them clean is really important. And also workers, just walking around. Some of these seeds stick to our pants legs, some of them stick to our shoes, and so lots of different places the weeds can come from. So sanitation is the key. I know this is something we hammer on a lot, but it's very important to try to reduce or minimize how much weed seeds we're bringing in to your nursery. And so like properly storing your container substrates. Ideally on a container pad, if you've got that, because the two things, it helps drain so they don't stay saturated. And it also, if you have walls around the edges, it keeps the weed seeds from blowing in. Always remove weeds from liners. Even if they've got weeds in them, that's fine. Take them out before they go to flower, because once they flower and set seed, that's where the issues start coming in. Do not reuse substrates. And so I know a lot of people, if they've got a bunch of dead plants, they'll just be like, well, I need to, I don't want to throw it away. I want to reuse it. It sounds okay, but obviously there's something wrong with that plant. So it could have a soil-borne pathogen in there, some diseases in there. It's also probably going to have a lot of weed seeds in there. And so if that old mix is not properly composted or steamed, then you're going to have problems down the road. So try not to reuse substrates. And also try not to reuse containers. And if you do, make sure to pressure wash them or steam clean them to get some heat in there to kill those weed seeds. And also just kind of keep weeds cleaned up from around the surrounding areas is a good practice. In your propagation structure, so like your shade house, your greenhouse, managing the floors, keeping the floors clean is key, because as you can see from these pictures, there's a nice carpet of vetch on the one and then a nice carpet of bittercress on the other one. And so it does not take long for this to happen inside, because especially during the winter, these weeds, they love that, warm temperature during the winter. It's moderate, plenty of moisture, they just really take off. And so keeping them clean with some post-emergent herbicides is really key. There's a lot of different options. Ideally you clean these houses up before you move plants in there, right? And so you can kill all the weeds that are there. But if you have plants already growing in the houses, you have to be really careful to make sure, if you're applying a post-emergent herbicide, to not get any kind of overspray or drift onto your plants, right? And so I like using a shielded sprayer, so a backpack with a wand with a shield on it helps to keep minimize the amount of drift that you're getting potentially from spraying these weeds and getting that herbicide onto your crop. A lot of different options: glufosinate, pelargonic acid, ammonium 908, caprylic acid, diquat, glyphosate. A lot of different options for post-emergent herbicides there. And some of these are also labeled for use inside of structures. And so you got to make sure not to get it on your crop, but you can still use them inside the overwintering house or greenhouse. Also, before moving plants into your propagation areas, try to treat the floors with pre-emergent herbicides. This is going to help you down the road, especially during the winter. If you're propagating stuff or overwintering stuff, putting down a pre-emergent before you move plants in there is really going to keep these weeds from growing over the winter. And so two of the products that work great for that are indaziflam and flumioxazin. The key is making sure to put these down before you move plants in. So currently, there are no pre-emergent herbicides labeled for use inside greenhouses or inside enclosed structures. And so if you're using a greenhouse, you got to make sure to treat them before you move the plants in. But they're really good tools for keeping these weeds from getting out of hand. It's been a good amount of previous research, prior work done on using pre-emergent herbicides in propagation, right? And so, but we've learned some things from that. So currently, there's no pre-emergent herbicides labeled for use in propagation, and that's why it's not widely done. Because we're trying to prevent weeds from growing in a crop, but you don't want to damage a crop, and so that's kind of where we run into issues. And so some of these pre-emergent herbicides are root inhibiting, and so they actually, once the roots start growing, they hit that chemical barrier, and they stop growth. And so obviously that's okay in your in your crop growing outdoors in containers, as long as you have a good rooted plant. You put a transplant in there, you put the herbicide down, it doesn't affect the roots. But in propagation, when we're growing seeds or we're trying to root cuttings, root inhibiting herbicides are an issue. And so we definitely need to stay away from the dinitroaniline class of herbicides. So Oryzalin, pendimethalin, prodiamine, trifluralin, those are something that we definitely don't use in propagation. But there are some other classes of pre-emergent herbicides that are non-root inhibiting. And so they may act on shoot growth or they may reduce photosynthesis. And so some of the things that people have found that have been safe to use in propagation are oxidizons, so Ronstar. Regal OO is actually a combination of oxidizon and oxyfluorphan. And also Gallery, isoxamin. These are a handful of active ingredients that some people have done some work on that have found promise and being able to safely use in propagation. I'm going to kind of go over some of the work I've done with them. But there are challenges, right? So there are herbicide label restrictions because a company doesn't want to be responsible for you losing a crop by using herbicides on something that may damage. And so currently there's no products labeled for use in enclosed structures. Some of the herbicides have language on there that limit use in small diameter containers. So they may say do not use in containers less than 4 or 6 inches in diameters. They also may have some language on there that says do not use in non-rooted cuttings or do not use in seedling propagation. And so, but there are some exceptions to the rules. And so some products are very flat out and tell you not to use it, but other ones, there's a lot of gray areas. And so we're going to kind of work around those a little bit, which gives us some opportunities, right? There are some newer active ingredients that have come on the market the last 10 or 15 years that haven't been really evaluated in propagation to see, do they have potential for those scenarios. So flumioxazin and indaziflam are two of our newer products that are on the market. They work great in container production, but we wanted to see, do they have some potential for use in propagation? And then also, there are just some plants that you're not going to be able to put herbicides on. They're just too sensitive or don't respond well to them. And so we need some alternatives to pre-emergent herbicides. And so that's where mulches come in. We've got a lot of options out there, but we needed to find out, okay, what mulches can we use in propagation that will work well and that are safe on our crops. And so kind of give y'all just a little short summary on some of the work I've done the last few years and looking at weed control and propagation. Just kind of introduce you to some of the mulches that we used. So rice hulls obviously is the most widely used mulch in container production. Works great in greenhouses. People use them outdoors. A lot of people are using them in hydrangeas now. Because it's a really light product. It's dry. It's hydrophobic. And so that's really how it works, right? The seeds land on top of the mulch. It's a dry surface, so they don't have enough moisture there to germinate. Works really great if you're only watering once a day, maybe twice a day. That layer stays dry. But no one's really looked to see how it works in propagation, where you have a lot of intermittent mist, a lot of moisture. And so we had to look at that. And I also wanted to look at some other alternative products. And so in propagation, obviously we're using smaller containers, so we need a finer material. So we can't use like pine bark nuggets or anything like that that's real chunky. So I found some products that are used actually for animal bedding. And so these different pelletized materials. So there's paper pellets and pine pellets. They're used for animal bedding. They break down once they get moist. And so I thought, well, maybe that would be maybe it would work as a good barrier for weeds. And so basically the paper pellets are just recycled paper that are formed into a pellet. And as they're saturated with water, they just kind of expand. Pine pellets are just sawdust. And so they're just compressed into a pellet. And once you water them in, they expand, kind of grow up like a chia pet. And then, but they actually create a really good barrier on the top of that pot. And so that's why I wanted to work with them and see how they would work in propagation. So when I started this, I started with seedlings. We have a nursery here who's doing a lot of work growing a lot of different plants in small containers from seeds. And so what I did, just screened several different pre-emergent herbicides and several different mulches to see how the plants would respond. And so with these, we grew sawtooth oak and willow oak, actually sowed the acorns in the pots, treated the pots with the herbicide or the mulch before the seeds germinated. And so this is just a few months after germination, and in general, we didn't really see any differences from any problems with any of the herbicides or the mulches. The plants grew great. Here's some sweet gum and sweet bay magnolia seedlings. These seedlings were actually germinated first and then transplanted into the small containers, and then we treated them with herbicide. So they were really small seedlings, maybe 4 to 6 true leaves. And then we sprayed over the top or spread the herbicides over the top of them and then put the mulches on top of them. In general, we didn't see any major issues with plant growth. All the plants grew pretty healthy without any issue. We also looked at yellow poplar and Coosa dogwood. And again, not really, out anything damaging as far as plant growth goes. But we did also look at root growth. And so I'm going to point out particularly, this is the data for the dogwood root growth. And so we actually washed the roots, dried the roots, and then figured out how much biomass we had there. We did see some reduction in root growth for the dogwood. And so particularly some of the herbicides like Treflan, Pendulum, and Barricade. So mostly the dinitroaniline class, we saw some root inhibition there and some damage to the roots. And we also saw a slight reduction in growth from the pine pellets, which was interesting. And then we also, for the yellow poplar, not as much of an issue with the root growth, but we did see some issues with Treflan and a slight reduction in root growth from the pine pellets. So that kind of gave me an idea, like what's going on with the pine pellets. There's something harmful in there that's actually damaging the crop. So we took this a little bit further. So we went from seedling propagation to actually rooting cuttings, and looking at seeing how the different herbicides and mulches would actually affect root growth from rooting cuttings. We tried a bunch of different species, and here we can kind of see the butterfly bush on the left. We tested several different pre-emergent herbicides. We had Regal 00, Fortress, Marengo, and then we had a couple of two of the mulches, rice hulls, pine pellets. And then we also looked at crepe myrtle. In general, just looking at how much root growth we have, we didn't see a lot of variation in the root growth between even the herbicides and the mulches compared to the non-treated control, which was very surprising to me. I was expecting to see a lot of death and destruction, but in general, we had really positive results from some of these materials. Just one note on the mulches, we use like a third of an inch layer of mulch on that, and so it's not a real thick layer. And so since that worked really well, we decided to kind of move forward and look at different depths of the mulches. And so seeing that we had some promise from some of the herbicides, so like Regal 00 tended to be really safe on some of these cuttings, these species that we were rooting. And so that gave us some good options there. And then, so then we actually wanted to look at, okay, well, how much mulch can we put on there before we start seeing potentially some damage? And so we did a trial. We looked at applying a half an inch of mulch and 1 inch of mulch into the pots and then sticking the cuttings in there. And we did see that, so in half an inch tends to be a good sweet spot. So it provides, good rooting. We didn't have any negative effects from it. Once you start putting an inch in there, we did see a slight reduction in root growth to a couple of the species that we were rooting. And so, and I think what's going on there is, like, once you're taking away some of that rooting substrate, and so when you're sticking that cutting in there, that's an inch of stem that's exposed to that mulch, and there's different physical properties there. So it may be staying too wet or too dry, and not an ideal environment for that cutting to start rooting. But in half an inch, we didn't see any problems. And so, looking at, okay, we found some materials that seem to be safe as far as pre-emergent herbicides that are safe to use during propagation. The mulches seem to be working pretty well, pretty safe in propagation, but how do they work actually on weed control? And so that's where we did several trials there. Showing you this one. This was interesting. And so this was just some containers where we had several different pre-emergent herbicides and a couple of different mulches. And the one that's circled, that is the pine pellet mulch. And so if you look at on the left, the picture on the left, this was a bitter cress. And so the top left pot in that picture is just the non-treated control. So that's just some seeds we put in the pot, let it grow. And then, hardly any growth in the pine pellet mix. And also some of the herbicides work really well too. And then on the right, kind of the same scenario. We had crabgrass. The pine pellet worked really well at suppressing the pine grass or the crabgrass, along with some of the other pre-emergent herbicides. So really good weed control from the pine pellets. And kind of want to show you this. And so that was in a trial where we did, I don't think we were irrigating as much. And so we actually wanted to put these mulches under mist where you're going to be rooting cuttings to see how the mulches would work, right? And so this picture on the left, this kind of gives you an idea. That top row of pots, that's all bitter cress that was sowed into the propagation material, the propagation substrate. So no herbicide, no mulch. That's just what's going to come up if you don't do anything. The row right below that is rice hulls. And so there's a lot of seed germination in there from the rice hulls. And what we think's going on there, typically we don't see that. If you're in a greenhouse, you're outdoors, you're only watering once a day, rice hulls work really well. Once you put rice hulls under that mist system, they stay wet. So there's so much moisture there, those seeds can actually germinate under propagation. So rice hulls are not as good of a mulch in a propagation scenario as they are in a greenhouse or a container production area. But if you look at the bottom two rows, that's the pine pellets and the paper pellets. You can see some little green dots in there. So there's tons of seedlings that germinated, but they didn't grow. And so that's the key to using these mulches. There's a lot of moisture there. They absorb water. There's moisture there for those seeds to germinate, but those roots can't go down through that barrier and get to the potting mix where the fertilizer is. So they just basically starve to death. I mean, look at the picture on the right. That's a trial we did with crabgrass, kind of the same results. Everything that's green is not pine pellets or paper pellets, basically. And so if you look at the top picture up here on the right, lots of those are little crabgrass seedlings. And so there's probably 20 or so seedlings in there. They germinated, but then they just stopped growing. You can actually see that the roots were growing above the mulch because they couldn't penetrate down into it. So it makes a really good barrier, works really good for weed control, even in the propagation environment. Just wanted to show you that. Oh, going back to that, we think there's a couple of things going on there. So physically, we think the barrier there is keeping those weed seeds from sending their root down into the potting mix. So there's a physical barrier, but there's also a chemical component, right? So going back to what I talked about earlier, the seedlings, the tree seedlings, we had slight reductions in growth. There is a small amount of phytotoxicity that could be going on with the pine pellets because it's just sawdust, and so there could be some chemicals in the wood that are inhibiting root growth. And so I had a graduate student who did a lot of this work. She did some leaching trials, and so we actually took the different mulches, saturated them, collect the leachate off of it, and then did some germination assays to see if that leachate would actually inhibit germination. And we found that for rice hulls, paper pellets, vermiculite, some of these other things, there was no phytotoxic effect, but with the pine pellets, there was. And so we actually saw a really dramatic reduction in germination from the leachate that was coming off there. Uh, so the couple of different ways that it works, but in general, that's the main thing is that it works. It does a really good job of keeping the weeds from growing. This is just a trial I set up at a local grower here. They were propagating a bunch of different things. They wanted to try out the pine pellets, see how it worked in their system. In general, it worked really well. It kept the weeds down, and they didn't really see any issues with rooting. The main thing here is figuring out the application amounts, because it is a little bit different, because you're putting out these pellets, but they're swelling, right? And so it's not like pine rice hulls where you just leave an inch or a gap in the top of your pot and then fill it to the top. You can't fill them up or they'll just overflow. And so you have to be a little bit more careful about how much material you're putting out. And so I think that takes a little bit getting used to. And so there may be some challenges, or some time there to adjust to using these products. But I think if once you learn how to use them, they would be pretty effective. Also, cost wise, I haven't done a cost analysis recently, but a couple years ago I put together analysis and looked at just the cost of the material. So for rice hulls and for pine pellets, and for the cost of material for the amount of area that you're putting out, spreading it out on, it was about the same for the cost of material. It's just figuring out the labor, how much labor and time it takes to apply these. But again, if that's something you want to do, you can kind of test it out on a small area and see how it works for your operation. So just in summary, for seedling propagation, we found some pre-emergent herbicides that are safe to apply prior to germination of some large seeded species like oats. And there are some that are safe to go over the top of small seedlings that you have growing. But you really need to test individual species, because different herbicides have different labels as far as what they're safe on. So you really need to make sure to test what you're growing first. And in cutting propagation, we found that Regal OO is safe on a lot of different species. You can put it down, and we were able to root a number of different species in it without any negative effects. As far as the mulches go, both the pine and paper pellets look like good alternatives to pre-emergence in cutting propagation. And just make sure that you apply them around a half an inch. Will give you good weed control and not have any negative effects on your plant growth. We have done a good amount of other research in this area, and so we've looked at applying the pre-emergent herbicides before sticking, at sticking, and after sticking the cuttings. And so that's something I'm working on, putting all that information together. But soon we'll have some more details on how that works. If there's any differences in when the timing of the actual application. We've also looked at growing these plants on, so rooting some cuttings with the different herbicides and mulches, and then transplanting them into containers and growing them out. And we found that as long as you don't see any issues in the propagation, in the rooting part of the program, we didn't really see any issues of them growing off in the containers. And so they did just fine. And then also we looked at, how long do these mulches last in propagation, or how long will the herbicide last in propagation? And so that's some information that we're going to be getting at pretty soon here too. Because you need to know, in outdoor production, you have a pretty good idea about how often you need to reapply, but in propagation that might be slightly different. So yeah, a lot of information that we've kind of generated the last few years, and so it's been some fun projects to work on. But I do have a disclaimer, so I'm gonna have to tell you this. So there are currently no pre-emergent herbicides labeled for use in propagation, but there are some opportunities there. So Regal OO does not have any restrictions for propagation. And so that's a product that if you're wanting to try out in propagation, long as it's outdoors and not in a greenhouse, that's something you can play with a little bit. Gallery herbicide does have some label restrictions, but they also have a statement on there that says the grower assumes all risk. And so it may say that, not to apply to unrooted liners or cuttings or to pots less than 6 inches wide, but you can try some of these on, if you're willing to accept some of the risk. But also make sure to check the label for crop species because, I've done some projects with a butterfly bush. And so we put the Regalo O and Gallery on those. Regalo, we didn't have any issues. Gallery pretty much killed them because butterfly bush is not labeled for use with Gallery. And so I always check the label on species. And then also if you do want to try some of these, test them on small groups in your nursery and on individual crop species because you may have different responses. Well, that wraps it up, and I'll take any questions. I appreciate you having me.
All right, that was great, Anthony. Really appreciate that. Anybody have any questions from the audience? You can unmute and ask, or you can type them in the chat box. Either way.
I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yeah, coming through fine, Stephen.
Okay. All right. I had to step out for about 8 minutes, so you might have covered that. But I do have a question. We propagate a lot of grasses in our own Lirio. And we basically just separate, and we still continue to rotate new crop in, so we don't have the same crop. But our biggest issue with weeds is in our grasses and in our Lirio. And I'm just been very leery and scared to use some of these herbicides, whether granule or not, in trying to prevent some of these weeds from getting in there because they'll come through the blades, sometimes from the center. Do you have any recommendations or have done any test trials on different types of Liriope or grasses that is effective?
So personally, I have not done any. There are some pre-emergent herbicides that are labeled for Liriope. I haven't done as much of that work, so right offhand, I don't know what that is, but I can get that information to you. And so, but I know there are a number that have been used, and we haven't seen any issues. I know you're talking about the granules can kind of get down into the blades, down into the crown on a plant.
Right.
But there are some products out there that we haven't really seen any issues with, and so.
Okay. Yeah.
We can get you that information, but right offhand, I don't know. And so, but are you? So there are some also, for your grasses, if you're mainly having issues with broadleaf weeds, there are some post-emergent herbicides that you can kind of go over the top of those that will not harm your grasses, but take care of your broadleaf weeds. And so that's another option you can think of there that you might consider.
Thank you.
There's also some graminicides, I think, that are also labeled for Liriope if you had grass coming up in your Mondo or Liriope. They're just target just grass specific species.
Okay. Yeah, we've looked into it. I mean, obviously we've had issues with nutsedge, which is not fun. But sometimes it's more headache than it is worth on some of these species. So we've done a few test trials, but I haven't had enough time to really dive into it. So I was hoping maybe you've had the opportunity to save me the trouble from having to go out there and do it.
No, I haven't, but there's some people that's done some work on it, so we can definitely get you some
Yeah.
ideas.
All right. Well, thank you.
Speaking of trials, Anthony, do you have any suggestions on how I have a couple of guys down here doing some trials, and I think it's smart. You've got a lot of money at risk, just shooting from the hips and treating a whole crop. And I know like one of the issues that I see is a lot of growers don't know how to apply accurately chemicals on a small scale. So if you only had a few flats, it's a little easier with some things than others. But do you have any recommendations on, the number of plants or flats or how to apply these products on a small scale accurately?
Yeah, so if you just want to try a few plats, like maybe part of a table or something, we use like shakers, like so we can measure out with the granulars. It's easy to kind of measure out the area and then just weigh out the product because you're putting out so many pounds per acre. So you can kind of work that down to like if it's 100 square feet, you need so many grams of product. And we just use these little shaker bottles that we basically big pepper shaker. And so we kind of go over the top and evenly apply them. That's one way to do it. If you're just wanting to do a smaller area, that'd be a good way to do it. Just get you a jug and poke some holes in the lid, and then just kind of evenly, measure out your material and then evenly apply that over a measured space. That would be a good way to do it. For the sprayables, you can use a backpack or a small handheld pump sprayer, and so but you still need to calibrate it to know how much you're putting out over a specific area. And so, but those are a lot easier to calibrate than the broadcast belly grinder type spreaders. And so those are a lot that take a lot more work to get calibrated. But yeah, for doing small areas, the granulars, you can weigh them out and then just kind of shake them out over an area. Couple of different ways to do it. But yeah, as far as how much to do, it just depends on how much they're willing to test on, how big area they want to do. So
And you had mentioned about those pine pellets. Do you think like fresh sawdust would have the same effect, or is the pellets or?
So that's a good question. And so it's hard, we have some places, we have different sawmills around here locally that have closed down. So we used to have a lot more access to sawdust. And so y'all probably have a lot more access down there where y'all are at. I haven't tried it, but I don't see why it wouldn't work. Because especially in propagation, you're just top dressing about, half an inch or so. If you were doing it in container production, I would say it would be a little bit more tricky, because if you're top dressing with fertilizer, that fertilizer is going to get tied into the top layer of that mulch. But if you're incorporating it into your potting mix already, you're not going to have that issue with fertility. And so I don't think I would think it would work the same. I haven't tried it, but if you have access to it, it'd be something good to try, because just you put it in there, and then it's, as long as it doesn't have any other chemicals or anything, if it's coming straight from a sawmill, it shouldn't have any issues with it.
I've seen a lot of people using perlite kind of as a weed barrier. I was curious if you thought about that to include in your treatments, or maybe why you didn't. Was it just maybe a cost consideration, or?
So we did try perlite, and it was very poor. It did not. I didn't point that out in the one picture I had, but yeah, it was covered in green. Yeah, for whatever reason. Well, number one, outdoor, if it's light, and so outdoors it doesn't work, 'cause it just blows around, and so you lose that barrier. But in general, yeah, in the protected areas, it just didn't work. I was surprised too, because I thought, well, maybe perlite that'd be a good one. It doesn't hold a lot of water. I thought it would be a good barrier, but it did not. Particularly in propagation, it didn't work well at all. So
I
yeah, I
think
was surprised too.
that and vermiculite, I think, are probably the two most common top dresses I've seen, especially in floriculture, propagation or seedling production. So
You
I
know,
was interested.
Yeah, I was surprised. I saw that one picture I showed with the grass, the different mulches, vermiculite was in there, and it was covered in green. And so I was very surprised, because, but not kind of surprised, but kind of not, because it does hold nutrients, it does hold water. And so it's, we put it in our propagation mixes. And so it helped to grow our plants. It's good for roots. And so, yeah, they liked it.
I screened some perlite out of the bag for particle size once, and it's really surprising what percentage of it does not actually contribute to pyroseed and works against you. So, I think it probably would work if it was screened and it was a high quality, product. But I think what most of us have been getting is pretty dusty.
Well,
Yeah,
I
I tried to
think
use the coarse stuff, so the
uh,
bigger chunks, and so I even tried that. But like you said, it
Still
just
didn't
kind of
work.
breaks down, and yeah.
Yeah.
that mostly happens in shipping and handling. So perlite's just so fragile, it breaks down. It's moved around. You could shake the bag a few times and create more dust as soon as you screened it. So
Mm. So that nursery that tried it on a little bit larger scale, some of the pellets, are they going to try it again? Are they feel like expanding it, or still playing around, or?
I've talked to them. Actually, they've kind of changed ownership, and so I'm going to see if the new owners are willing to try it again. It's basically a cost thing. If they can find it in bulk, they'll use it. I think they have a lot of rice holes still, and so I think they're just trying to use rice holes. But again, it doesn't work as good in propagation. But I'm gonna work on them and see if they can do it. It is a labor thing. It takes a little bit different perspective to know how much to put out over the area. So you got to train, the workers, whoever's doing it, a little bit more closely, watch them a little more closely to make sure you're not just putting too much out. And so, but yeah, I think it's a good opportunity or, option for growers. And so if they can find it in bulk and cost wise, it works out for them, and labor wise, it doesn't take too much extra labor to do.
Great.
And you got it at a pet store?
Yeah, I got it at Tractor Supply, but yeah, but it's used for horse bedding, so you can get it in big bags, and so you can get it in bulk. It's just finding the supplier for it and getting it shipped. But yeah, you can find it in bigger areas. But yeah, apparently it's just used really big in horse bedding. So, but also other rabbits and different things too. Other animals use it too, smaller animals. But yeah, it does a good job of soaking up the urine and everything, and so yeah.
Well, good. Well, do we have any more questions?
Hi, Ethan. I have a question.
Yeah.
So, looking at the root dry weight data, it seems like the granular trifling 5G root lets the roots thrive, while the spray grade trifling F really hammered them. Do you think that's mainly because the granules stay on the surface instead of leaching down into the root, like the root zone, or is there a slower release given the cuttings time to toughen up before any herbicide reaches them? What's your take?
Yeah, great point. That's exactly why we did that trial. I was looking at sprayable versus granular formulations. I didn't really point that out there, but yeah, that's exactly what we were looking for to see. Did it matter if the based on the formulation? I think exactly what you're saying. I think the sprayable potentially leach down in there a little bit more than the granular did. And now the dinitroenolins, they will leach into the pine bark, but they don't go very far. And so they get tied up with the pine bark particles, and so they do get tied up a little, but they will leach down farther than some of these other materials. So I do think it was probably a formulation. The sprayable just leached slightly deeper into the soil where the roots were, and the granule didn't. But yeah, that's exactly why I was trying to see. I was curious about that too. It's like, well, does it matter the formulation that you're using? Will you get more damage from one or the other? And so
Yeah.
it depended on the crop species. Like on that one, there was a big difference. On some of them, not so much. And so it's kind of variable. But yeah, I think that's exactly what's going on with that. Yep.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
All right. Well, great. Well, Anthony, thank you so much. That was really informative. Got a lot out of it, and appreciate that. And folks, we'll have this posted on YouTube probably within a week. And if you wanted to rewatch it or send it to anybody, you'd be able to access it at that link that Russell put in the chat box there. But anyway, thank you guys, and we'll see you next month. Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.